Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into the Shroud of Turin.
All right.
It's a really fascinating artifact. It's been debated for centuries,
Mm,
and people still are really fascinated by it.
absolutely.
And it has a lot of religious significance for a lot of people.
Yes.
So we're going to really break down all of the history of it,
Right.
and the scientific findings around it, and the
Yeah.
the religious aspects of it as well.
Yeah. So you sent us a PDF document, and it's got, all the information we need
Yeah.
to really understand,
Yeah.
what is it about the shroud that's so fascinating to people? And,
Yeah.
what makes it so controversial? And, we can get into some of the theories about its
Sure.
origins,
Sure.
and, look at some of the scientific tests that have been done on it.
Yeah, so for listeners who maybe aren't totally familiar with it,
Right.
the Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth
Mm.
that seemed to have an image of a man on it. And this image appears to be the front and back of a naked man. And the details are really kind of eerily similar to traditional descriptions of Jesus of Nazareth
Yeah.
after the crucifixion.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, when you see the image, especially when you look at the photographic negative of it, it really does look like,
Yeah.
the image of a man who's been crucified. And
Yeah.
you can see details like, the wounds on the hands and the feet and
Right.
the crown of thorns and,
Yeah, and there are also blood stains
yeah,
found.
reddish brown stains
Yeah.
that,
That correlate to those.
yeah, they're in the places where you would expect to see
Yeah.
wounds from crucifixion.
And it's pretty big, right?
Yeah.
This cloth?
Yeah, it's quite a large piece of linen. It's about 4.4 meters long by 1.1 meters wide. So
Right.
roughly, 14 and a half feet by three and a
Wow.
half feet.
Okay, so this thing is in Turin right now.
Yes, that's
It's
Turin.
in a special chapel.
In the Chapel of the Holy Shroud
Yeah.
in Turin, Italy.
Yeah, okay, so how far back can we trace this thing? How far back does its history go?
Well, the earliest we can really trace it is to about 1354.
Okay.
And
So not that far back.
no, not as far back as you might expect for something, that's
Okay.
purported to be
Yeah.
the burial shroud of Jesus.
Okay, but it shows up in 1354.
Yeah, in Lirey, France is where it first kind of pops up in the historical record.
Okay. And at that time, I mean,
Mhm.
what were people saying about it?
Well, there was already some controversy, even
Yeah.
that early on.
Okay, so people weren't just like, oh, this must be it.
Well, some people believed it was authentic, but there were already those who were skeptical.
Okay, so people were debating it even back then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and then just a few decades later, there was that Bishop Pierre Darcisse,
Right.
who really went on the record saying that this is a forgery,
Hmm.
and even claimed that he had proof of that, right?
Yeah, he claimed that an artist had confessed
Oh,
to creating the shroud, which, back then would have been seen as pretty damning evidence.
so what do we know about this confession or this alleged confession? I mean, is there any more information about that, or is it just kind of lost to history?
Unfortunately, the details of that are pretty murky. We don't have any like
Yeah.
signed confession or anything.
Right.
It's more based on, historical accounts and, the bishop's own writings.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, so that was a pretty big challenge to the authenticity of the shroud,
Absolutely.
right from the beginning.
Okay.
So despite that, it still kind of continued to be, I guess, of interest.
Yeah.
And then eventually it came under the ownership of this very powerful family, the House of Savoy,
Right.
and they moved it to Chambéry. Right?
That's right.
Okay, and then there's this big incident that happened in Chambéry.
Yeah, the fire.
Yeah, this fire in 1532.
In 1532, there was a fire in the chapel where the shroud was being kept,
Right.
and molten silver from a reliquary dripped onto the shroud,
Oh, wow.
which was folded up at the time.
Oh, okay.
And it caused some significant damage.
Yeah, like burn holes and stuff.
Yeah, burn holes and scorches.
Wow.
But luckily, it survived the fire.
Yeah, it's amazing that it survived.
It is, and, the poor Clare nuns who were tasked with repairing it
Right.
did an amazing job.
They patched it up.
Yeah, they sewed patches onto the linen to kind of hold it together.
Yeah, so I guess in a way that fire kind of adds to the story of the shroud in a weird way.
Yeah, it's part of its history now,
Yeah.
and it's something that, researchers can look at
Right.
to try and understand, the different things that have happened to the shroud over the centuries.
Right. And I mean, I imagine that having those patches there
Mm-hmm.
also helps in a way to authenticate, these
Right.
parts of it.
Yeah, because you can date those patches
Right.
and, see how they were made and what kind of materials were used.
Okay, so then the Savoy family move their capital to Turin.
Right, in 1578.
Okay. And they brought the shroud with them.
Yep. They took it with them to Turin,
And it's been there ever since.
and it's been in Turin ever since.
And it got its own chapel, right?
Yes. It's been housed in the Chapel of the Holy Shroud since 1683.
Wow, okay.
Which was designed specifically for the shroud by the architect Guarino Guarini.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, that just shows how important this piece of linen was
Right.
considered.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's been passed down eventually to the Catholic Church.
Right. So when the last king of Italy, Umberto II, died in 1983, he bequeathed the shroud to the Catholic Church.
Wow, okay. And even more recently, it's been threatened by fire again.
Yeah, in 1997, there was another fire
Oh, wow.
in the chapel.
Okay.
Luckily, it was saved, but that led to some restoration work in 2002,
Yeah.
where they actually removed the backing cloth and the 30 patches that had been added after that 1532 fire.
Oh, wow.
And that allowed them to examine the back of the shroud for the first time.
Really? And was there anything interesting on the back?
Well, they found, a faint partial image on the back,
Oh, really?
which, just adds another layer.
Another layer to the mystery.
Yeah, another layer to the mystery.
So it's been displayed again relatively recently.
Yeah, in 2010 and 2015, it was put on public display,
Okay.
and millions of people came to see it.
Yeah. And today it's under really high security.
Oh, absolutely. It's in a bulletproof case.
Yeah.
It's kept in an airtight environment with argon and oxygen.
Wow.
The temperature and humidity are carefully controlled.
Wow. Okay, so this thing is being really carefully preserved.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the shroud itself, the cloth.
Okay.
What are the key characteristics of the linen?
Well, it's a rectangular piece of linen, as we've said, and it's woven in a particular pattern called a 3-to-1 herringbone twill.
Okay.
So it's like a diagonal weave,
Okay.
and it's made from flax fibrils.
Okay.
And the image itself is this very faint kind of straw yellow color,
Okay.
and it depicts a bearded man with long hair parted in the middle.
Okay.
And based on measurements, he appears to have been quite tall, somewhere between 1.7 and 1.88 meters tall.
Okay.
And he seems to have had a muscular build.
Okay.
And then, of course, there are those reddish-brown stains,
Yeah.
which, as we mentioned, are in the places where you would expect to see wounds from crucifixion.
Right.
So there are stains on the wrists and the feet, a wound in the side,
Right.
and markings around the head that are consistent with a crown of thorns.
Okay. And then, of course, there's all the damage from that fire.
Right.
And then the repairs that were done afterwards.
Yeah, so that's all part of the physical description of the shroud as well.
Yeah. Now, photography has played a really big role in the study of the shroud, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
It's really kind of brought it into the modern era.
Yeah, in 1898, an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photographs of the shroud.
Okay.
And when he developed the negatives, he made this amazing discovery
Yeah.
that the image was much clearer in the negative than in the positive.
So, like, the shroud itself is almost like a negative.
Yeah, it's almost like a photographic negative.
Ah, okay. And this has really fueled a lot of the
Right.
investigation and even the devotion to the shroud.
Absolutely, because it made the image so much more visible and
Yeah.
so much more detailed.
Okay, so now let's get into the kind of the religious side of things.
Okay.
How do the Gospels talk about the burial of Jesus and the linen cloths that were used?
Well, in the Gospels as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all mention that Joseph of Arimathea
Right.
wrapped Jesus' body in a linen shroud before placing him in a tomb.
Okay.
And the word that they use is sendon, which is the Greek word for shroud.
Okay.
But the Gospel of John actually gives us a little bit more detail.
Okay.
It mentions linen cloths, othonia,
Oh.
and a separate cloth that was placed over Jesus' head.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And that's actually been used as an argument against the shroud's authenticity, hasn't it?
Yes. John Calvin in the 16th century argued that the shroud couldn't be genuine because it shows the whole body covered,
Right.
whereas Jewish burial customs at the time would have involved wrapping the body and the head separately.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So he was saying that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. So despite these arguments, the shroud is still obviously very important
Oh, yeah.
to a lot of people.
To many Christians.
Yeah.
It's seen as a very important relic.
Yeah, and it has a much bigger following than any other supposed burial cloths.
Right.
Jesus.
Yeah, and it's important to understand the Catholic Church's position on this.
Yeah.
They don't actually say whether it's authentic or not.
Okay, so they're not saying, yeah, this is definitely it.
No.
And they're not saying, no, this is definitely not it.
Right.
They're just like, we don't know.
It's a matter of personal faith
Yeah.
for individual believers.
And they're saying that, whether or not it's authentic
Mhm.
doesn't really change the core teachings Yeah. of Christianity.
No.
Okay, so it's really up to the individual to decide what they believe. But it is venerated by, various Christian traditions.
Yeah, not just Catholics, but also many Protestants.
Like, really?
Baptists, Lutherans, Methodists, a lot of different Christian groups see the shroud as an important relic.
Okay.
And there are even some Lutheran parishes that have replicas of the shroud for educational purposes.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and this is particularly true with the devotion to the holy face of Jesus.
Right.
And, Secondo Pia's photograph really contributed to that.
Yeah, because it made that image so much clearer. And
Right.
so, people could really focus on the face of Jesus.
Right. And then that led to the creation of the Holy Face medal,
Yeah.
which a lot of Catholics wear
Mm-hmm.
as a symbol of their faith.
Right.
Okay, so popes throughout history have made statements about the shroud.
Right.
And they haven't always been consistent, have they?
No, not always. So in 1390, Pope Clement VII said that it was a painting or a representation
That's
made to
sad.
resemble the true shroud.
Okay, so he was saying it's a fake.
Basically, yeah.
But then in 1506, Pope Julius II
Yeah.
authorized the veneration of it.
Right. So he kind of reversed that earlier decision
Wow, okay.
and said that, people could venerate the shroud as a genuine relic.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he say it's real.
Yeah.
Okay, and then more recent popes have been a little bit more ambiguous.
Yeah. They've been more cautious,
Right.
They haven't really said definitively whether they believe it's authentic or not.
Right.
They've kind of acknowledged the spiritual significance of it, but
Yeah.
they haven't really weighed in on the scientific debate.
Yeah, they're kind of saying this is a mystery.
Yeah.
And we respect that it's a mystery.
Right.
Okay, so let's get into all that science now.
All right.
There's been a lot of scientific analysis done on the shroud.
Oh, tons of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been one of the most studied artifacts in history, I think.
Probably. Yeah.
So the first real scientific examination started in the late 60s, early 70s.
Right.
And they were really focused on just figuring out how to preserve it and how to test it.
Yeah. How to test it without damaging it.
Yeah, because obviously this is
Yeah.
a very delicate object.
Very fragile.
And so that led to the formation of STURP, right?
Yeah. The Shroud of Turin Research Project.
Yeah.
Which was formed in 1978.
Okay.
And they brought together over 30 scientists
Wow.
from all different disciplines
Okay.
to study the shroud.
Wow. Okay. So they really
Mhm.
put a lot of effort into trying to figure out what this thing is.
Absolutely.
Okay. So one of the first things they looked at was the pigments.
Right.
Yeah.
Because one of the big questions was,
Yeah.
is the image painted?
Right.
And if so, what kind of paints were used?
Yeah. And Walter McCrone was the guy who really kind of
Right.
took the lead on that.
Yeah, he was a very well-respected microscopist,
Okay.
and he examined samples from the shroud in 1978
Okay.
using adhesive tape
Okay.
to lift off tiny samples.
Right.
And he looked at them under a microscope, and he concluded that the image was actually painted
Oh, wow.
using red ochre pigment
Okay.
and a gelatin medium.
So a pretty common kind of technique for the time.
Yeah, it's a technique called grisaille,
Okay.
which was used in medieval times.
Okay. And he said that even the bloodstains were fake.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. He said that they were painted with vermilion pigment.
Wow. Okay, so he was basically saying this whole thing is a medieval painting.
Yeah. Basically, yeah.
Okay, but not all the scientists agreed with him.
Right. No, a lot of them disagreed with his findings.
Yeah.
They said that, while he may have found traces of pigments,
Yeah.
that didn't necessarily mean that the whole image was painted.
Right.
They pointed to the fact that the image was very superficial.
Yeah.
It only affected the topmost fibers of the linen.
Right.
And they also said that, there wasn't any pigment binder
Yeah.
in the areas that they analyzed.
Okay, so there was a lot of debate
Yeah, a lot of back and forth.
about whether or not he was right.
Okay, and then there was a really big development in 1988, right?
Yeah, that's when they did the radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, the radiocarbon dating, and that seemed to be like, okay, we finally have a definitive answer.
Yeah, because radiocarbon dating is, a very reliable method for
Right.
dating organic materials.
Yeah,
And so they took samples from the shroud
right.
and they sent them to 3 different labs.
Okay.
Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich.
Okay, so 3 independent labs
Yeah,
all doing the same test.
yeah. And they all came back with the same result,
And that was,
that the linen dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD.
wow. Okay, so that puts it squarely in the medieval period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's pretty consistent with when the shroud first appears in the historical record.
Yeah, so that seems like pretty convincing evidence that it's not from the time of Jesus.
You would think so, yeah.
Okay, but people who believe in the authenticity of the shroud, I mean, they've come
Mm.
up with some counter arguments.
Aren't they?
They have.
What are some of the things they've said?
Well, one of the main arguments is that the samples might have been contaminated
Okay.
with newer material.
So, like, if there was some kind of, I don't know, like a patch,
Yeah, or even just, handling of the shroud
right?
could have introduced newer carbon,
Yeah.
which would have skewed the results.
Okay, so they're saying the samples weren't pure.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
And there was also the theory that the samples might have been taken from a repair patch.
Oh, right, from one of those patches that was put on
Yeah,
after the fire.
after the fire.
Yeah, okay. And then there was this biocontamination theory.
Yeah, so the idea that bacteria or fungi
Right.
might have grown on the shroud over the centuries,
Yeah.
and that could have affected the carbon dating.
Okay. And then there was this really interesting one about carbon monoxide.
Yeah, the carbon monoxide theory, which is
Yeah.
a bit more technical. But the idea is that carbon monoxide could have reacted with the linen.
And changed the carbon isotopes in a way that would make it seem younger.
Wow, okay, so a lot of different explanations for why that carbon dating might be wrong.
Yeah.
But scientists have looked into all of these, haven't they?
Oh, yeah. They've done a lot of research
Yeah,
to
yeah.
try and address these
And
concerns.
what have they found?
Well, for the most part, they haven't really found any evidence to support these alternative explanations.
Okay, so they're basically saying that
Yeah.
the carbon dating was probably accurate.
Yeah, most scientists agree that the carbon dating is probably accurate.
Okay, so that seems like pretty strong evidence against the authenticity of the shroud.
It does, yeah.
Okay, but let's keep going.
Right.
What about the material itself?
Okay.
What can we learn from the linen?
Well, as we mentioned before, the shroud is woven in a herringbone twill pattern,
Right.
which isn't really typical of burial cloths from the 1st century AD.
Okay.
In Judea, they usually used a plain weave for burial shrouds.
Oh, okay, so this is another thing that doesn't quite match up
Yeah.
with what we would expect from that time period.
And there was actually a discovery in 2000 of a 1st century burial shroud near Jerusalem,
Wow. Okay.
and it was a plain weave.
So just like they were saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay, so that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there are those blood stains, right?
Right, the reddish-brown stains, which
Yeah.
have been a major focus of the scientific investigation.
Yeah, so are they blood or not? That's the big question.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, so we know Macron said they were pigment,
Yeah.
but other scientists have found iron oxide in them.
Yeah, which is a component of hemoglobin,
Right,
which is found in blood.
right. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not blood.
No, not necessary.
But the skeptics say that the blood flows look too neat.
Yeah, they say that the bloodstains look too perfect.
Yeah, like they were painted on
Right.
or something.
Yeah, and there's also the possibility that the stains could have come from people handling the shroud.
Oh, right. So like centuries of people touching it.
Yeah, over the years.
Okay, and then there's that DNA analysis that was done, right?
Yeah, in 2015.
Okay, and what did that show?
Well, they found a lot of different kinds of DNA.
Right.
Human DNA, plant DNA, even some DNA that they couldn't identify.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a very mixed bag.
Okay.
And the plant DNA came from all over the place.
Bro-
Europe, the Middle East, even some from Asia.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this thing has really been around.
It seems so, yeah.
Okay, so what did the researchers make of all that DNA evidence?
Well, they said that it could be consistent with a medieval European origin for the shroud
Okay.
because, it would have been handled by a lot of different people over
Right.
the centuries.
Yeah.
But they also said that it could fit with the idea of a journey from the Near East,
Right.
picking up DNA along the way.
Yeah.
And they even suggested that the linen itself might have been made in India
Wow. Okay.
based on some of the plant DNA.
So once again, the DNA is kind of interesting, but doesn't really give us a definitive answer.
No, not really.
Okay, so what about the anatomy of the image on the shroud?
Okay.
There was that early claim that it was anatomically flawless.
Yeah, in 1902, a French physician named Yves Delage
Right.
said that the image was perfectly accurate.
Oh, wow.
But later on, other scientists started to point out some problems.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, the wounds on the wrists and the feet don't really match up with what we know about Roman crucifixion practices from
Okay.
archaeological evidence.
Right, because if it was a real imprint,
Mhm.
it should be accurate, right?
Exactly.
So that's a bit of a red flag.
Yeah.
And then some people have said that the proportions of the figure are a bit off.
Right. They say that the forehead is too big,
Okay.
the arms are too long,
Okay.
and the hands are in a weird position.
Yeah.
And they say that these are all characteristics of Gothic art.
Oh, okay. So medieval art.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's not a real imprint. Maybe it's an
Mhm.
artistic representation. Okay, so the image itself, I mean, this is really kind of where it gets interesting, I think.
Yeah, the image is really the most mysterious part of the whole thing.
Yeah, because it's not like a regular painting.
Right. It's not like any other painting that we know of.
Yeah, so scientifically, what do we know about this image?
Well, we know that it's very superficial.
Okay.
The discoloration only affects the topmost fibers of the linen.
Okay.
It doesn't penetrate very deep at all.
Right.
And it's what's called an aerial density image,
Okay.
which means that the darkness of the image depends on how many discolored fibers there are in a given area.
Oh, okay, so it's kind of like a halftone image.
Yeah, kind of like a newspaper photograph.
Yeah.
Where you have different densities of dots.
Okay, so it's not like a continuous tone.
No.
Okay, and then there's that interesting observation that the blood image seems to have been formed by contact.
Mhm.
But the body image doesn't.
Right, which is another mystery.
Yeah. So how do we explain that?
That's the big question, yeah.
Okay, so what are some of the main hypotheses that have been put forward
Right.
to explain how this image got there?
Well, there's the painting hypothesis.
Right. That was Macron's idea.
Yeah, that the image was painted with pigments.
Yeah.
And then there's the medieval photography hypothesis.
Oh, wow.
Which is a bit more controversial.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, the idea is that they might have used some kind of early photographic technique.
Yeah.
But, there are a lot of problems with that theory.
Yeah, like we don't really have any evidence that they had that kind of technology back then.
Yeah, and the lenses and the chemicals that they would have needed
Yeah.
probably didn't exist in the medieval period.
Okay, so that one's a bit of a long shot.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
There's the dust transfer hypothesis, which is the idea that they might have used carbon dust to create the image.
So like they put something on top of the cloth.
Yeah, like a bas relief or something,
Right.
and rubbed carbon dust over it. Oh, okay, that's interesting.
And then there's the bas relief hypothesis.
Yeah.
Which is similar, but instead of using dust, they might have actually scorched the linen
Oh, wow.
over a bas relief.
Okay.
And there have been some successful attempts to recreate the facial image using this method.
Oh, wow.
But it's much harder to do the whole body.
Yeah.
Because you have to get the shading just right.
Yeah, okay. And what about the Maillard reaction?
Right. The Maillard reaction is a chemical process
Yeah.
that causes browning in food.
Right.
So the idea is that maybe something similar happened with the shroud,
Okay.
but there were some problems with that theory too.
Okay, like what?
Well, the shroud doesn't show any signs of decomposition,
Okay.
which you would expect if the Maillard reaction had occurred.
Right.
And the coloration of the image is pretty uniform,
Okay.
which also doesn't really fit with the Maillard reaction.
Okay, so we've got a lot of interesting theories,
Yeah.
but none of them are perfect. No, none of them really explain everything.
And then, of course, we have to talk about the fringe theories.
Right.
Every mystery has its fringe theories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what are some of the stranger ideas?
Well, there are people who claim to see images of coins on the shroud,
Okay.
flowers, writing, all sorts of things.